The other big story in the newspapers, obviously, is what's happening in the world of rugby, and I'm delighted to say we've got Keith Wood with us this morning to talk to us about this. Keith, good morning to you. How are you?
Good morning. I'm excellent, thank you. How are you?
I'm good. So, the move from the South African provinces to join an expanded Pro 12, Pro 14, as it's going to be a Pro 16, has long been spoken about, but we got a lot of clarity on it. It's going to be the best 4 South African provinces who are going to be joining, and I guess the first thing is, instinctively, do you think this is a good thing or is this damaging? What's your take on it?
I'm uncertain yet because I haven't seen the full details. I'm a little bit. I was never really comfortable with the idea of the Pro 12 going down to Pro 14 and bringing in a couple of development squads, development teams from South Africa. I wasn't that comfortable before all the stuff that's going on recently, but in light of COVID, there are a couple of different things. One is you need to have as much money in the kitty as you possibly can, and you need to try and get that done and sorted. But the other one is, where does this fit with player welfare, the sort of the flip side of it? And I still haven't seen enough detail as to how that would actually fit in. An awful lot is up in the air. I think having a tournament that travels from one hemisphere to another doesn't seem to make any sense for me. I think flying down to be there for a week or 2 weeks to come back, and for those teams to have to do it as well, I just think the season is incredibly congested as it is. And forget about the COVID seasons, but what it's going to look like afterwards. They're already incredibly congested. I'm not that comfortable with the idea of that being the case. I think it was the Celtic League, and ever since then it has struggled for its identity. It's very hard to say that this is a reasonable tournament in the base for the Celtic nations and Italy and now South Africa. For me, it doesn't make geographical sense. It does make time sense in terms of you're playing at the same time, but even then, it seems to be, for me, an uncomfortable fit.
Okay. The other thing that's been widely speculated about over the last period of time is, of course, the potential for the Six Nations to become the Seven Nations, and so ultimately that would mean South Africa joining and playing here and moving out from the competition that they've been in for a long period of time. There is a possibility that the Six Nations stays Six Nations and that Italy end up getting kicked out, but this, I think, Keith, takes us very far back to the start of lockdown and our State of the Union conversations. It looked for all the world like there was a period of time where a global calendar could have been agreed, and then that was off the table because it seemed like the unions couldn't. It seemed like there was almost brinkmanship where we were very close to it. Briefings were put out to rugby journalists around the world that it was imminent, and then all the talk disappeared. And now I wonder if this is the first of a number of dominoes that are going to fall that try to make some semblance of sense and begin to answer some of the player welfare issues, for example, that you've raised.
Well, I think that becomes very important. It's funny, strangely, Stuart Barnes and I disagreed on this. I don't know if we did it on air or not, but I could see South Africa coming in to an international competition because it would actually nearly cut down on their travel, and it would only leave to one travel every 2 years in a Six Nations type competition. I actually see merit within that, and the time zone's been very important within that. I think there's going to be an awful lot of ructions over the next year because we started it with the State of the Union in us trying to understand it for ourselves. All the clubs and all the countries are dealing with, Philip Brown called it an existential threat, because there may be no money coming in at any stage, and you build a plan and it changes at a decision from the government. I would say rightly, if they have the evidence to dictate it. So decisions are being made and being broken very quickly. We may end up with the survival of the fittest, and what would the game look like then? Because as it stands at the present moment in time, with everything changing, I think it becomes very difficult for certain teams to survive, particularly the UK, actually. And there was an article I read early this morning that George Ford wouldn't play for Leicester. He might play one match in the first 13 matches for Leicester in this season coming. because of the internationals that's going. Like, that will never be allowed to last. Something has to break for that to be the case. Because in that instance, Leicester really wouldn't want to have players playing for England because they won't be playing for the club. That is a full and straight conflict of interest. Now, then you equally have Pat Lam talking in the last day saying, well, we're going to lose a chunk of players to playing for England. Isn't that great? It's a totally different philosophy. He said, fine, it's fantastic. But they have a lot of money sitting behind them, and they know that they can survive during that period of time. So it isn't like for clubs, countries, provinces. We're gone into an incredibly strange period of time.
And it's difficult to see what the long-term outcome is going to be until an agreement is in place about what a global calendar looks like. Let's just go back to the Pro 16 as it's going to be. Obviously, the competition starts this weekend. There's a talk that the South African sides will join in March, and it's some kind of hybrid for the first season, and eventually whatever the schedule gets worked out is going to be. They're talking about perhaps having fewer games in the competition than they would have now, maybe one or two, maybe. So I think it might be a 12-game regular season and then a post-season. That might go some way to allaying the player welfare fears. A more meaningful programme of games where your frontline internationals play the vast majority of them, and every match matters.
Yeah, I think that's what most fans would like to have. It's very hard to bring young players through in that system, by the way. And like, we castigate the Pro 14 a lot, or the Pro 12 when it was a lot, for there being a lot of games that were weak with weakened teams. But that is an opportunity to get players through, and we do need that opportunity. And if it's only every game that matters, you'll find that the top players will get squeezed to the point of where their performances will start to drop because they're playing too much. Now, I think we could still play a little bit more in Ireland, strangely. I think not as much as the UK, but we could play a couple of matches more a season. I think that wouldn't do us any harm. But it's having a fractured competition, a competition that you play at home one year and away the following year. And I know that happens in the Six Nations, but there's a lack of fluidity. And so I haven't seen all the plans in terms of what this is going to look like, because I don't know exactly that they have them tied down because of the changing COVID situation. So that chops and changes everything. So you need a high level of flexibility in year one. But for me, it's a patched together competition. So that's where I look at it as being something that's a bit difficult. The Premiership in England makes sense. Actually, the Celtic League made sense. It kind of made sense after a fashion when you put Italian teams into it because they were involved in the Six Nations. But really, as a competition, it's the Celtic League. It doesn't make sense. And for me, it makes less sense going down to South Africa. So I don't know. If they can get the balance right for the players, that's one thing. If they can make it a coherent competition, that you don't need a slide rule to figure out who qualifies, I think that's good. I do think the European Cup this year, they've tidied it up. It's made it incredibly difficult for the coming season, but they've tidied it up to fit into very difficult situations. I do like that. I think that's well organised for this year. It may not be for the years afterwards, but look, there's clarity required for all of these things. I look at it, and for me, it's a hodgepodge, and fans kind of like what they want to support. They want to be able to see it on one station and not have to jump from one thing to the other. They don't want to have to guess who could possibly qualify if 15 different things happen at once. And so for me, I think it's unfinished at this stage.
Keith, in the Irish Times this morning, Gordon Darcy is writing about this, and he says that only the strongest will survive when the South African teams join the Pro 16. He says Leinster have the squad to compete, but Munster and Ulster without their internationals will struggle to cope with this behemoth rugby nation. He says he envisages this setting Scottish rugby back a decade, and also voices huge concern for the Welsh clubs as well. Do you go along with that the weak or the vulnerable teams in the Pro 14 as it is right now are going to really struggle to make any progress?
Well, I think that's an interesting perspective, and I think we'll hear that and more interesting perspectives over the next week when this starts to fall in. If I bring it back just a little, South Africa play a particular style of rugby, and it's very heavy hitter forward dominated, big forward dominated, giant forward dominated. That's not the only way to play. It is a successful way of playing when you are that size, but other teams need to play in a different fashion. And I don't know if we were dealing with that day in, day out, whether we'd be able to deal with it better, but we can't meet it head on in terms of that, because that just isn't our physique. It isn't the national physique. And if the only way to do with that is to bring in other players to be able to deal with it, it's an absolutely self-defeating purpose. So, look, we need the Pro 14, Pro 16, whatever it is, to help be a good building board for the international team, in association with the European Cup. That's what we are looking for as Irish clubs and provinces. For us to be going into something that takes away from that is obviously foolhardy. But we do need a higher level of competition, and not just because of the comments over the last 2 or 3 weeks because of Leinster losing to Saracens. Leinster didn't play well enough on that day. Saracens played brilliantly on that day. They played a very simplistic game plan and played it perfectly all the way to the end. And that happens sometimes. That doesn't mean that the Pro 14 isn't fit for purpose. It means that it wasn't fit for purpose in that particular moment in time. I think just because this year hasn't worked so well for the Irish provinces, I don't think we write it off. That's happened 3 or 4 times in the history of professional rugby. So I wouldn't be jumping to big assumptions yet, but I think we need to look incredibly carefully over the decisions that are being made as to how they fit and suit different countries. It can't just be about the cash at this present moment in time. And in some cases, it actually has to be. And that's how difficult it is. I mean, the game is hemorrhaging money. Look, and we've had this discussion often, my one that I would love to see, because I think it would fill every ground in the country, in all the countries, when the grounds are allowed to be filled, is a British and Irish league, because I think it makes sense regionally. It makes sense to rivalries that we have with the English clubs in particular, but some of the Scottish clubs, the big Welsh clubs. We do have a good rivalry there. We have a great travelling support. Again, when that can happen, that makes sense. It also fits into what the Lions would be. So one of the reasons behind this from South Africa has been, well, it means that their players will get a really good battle hardening before the Lions go down afterwards. Let's just make it perfect for them, really, rather than for us. And I'm not saying it in that fashion. I'm not being that facetious about it. For me, it just seems like a convoluted setup. I don't know where it fits for us at all. And that's one of the issues with some of the decisions that are being made. Decisions are being made entirely for financial reasons, and I understand that. But I think we're at a very tough spot, actually, in the history of our sport.
Absolutely, and there's loads more to that that's going to, I think, become clear in coming weeks. One of the other things that hasn't finally been nailed down is exactly what CBC's involvement is with respect to the various deals. There's some informed whispers that everything's just gone a little bit cold at the moment, and maybe that's propelling these decisions at the moment to try and, if you're Pro 14 or the owners of that competition, all of a sudden you beef up the potential TV deals by adding the new market of South Africa, and you say, come on, let's get the final parts of that deal worked out. Has all the CBC deal gone through with the Premiership? Has it all finished with the Six Nations? Laporte was talking about figures and new percentages recently enough as well. So, I think the existential crisis hasn't gone away. Separate to this, and kind of as part of the conversation that we've been having, about 18 months ago, we threw out there the whole notion, when the IRFU had money, about whether or not they should buy into London Irish. It does seem, Alan Quinlan has told us on the show this week, that conversations have certainly been had at a very high level between the IRFU and between London Irish about allowing players to play for London Irish and to continue to be selected within the Irish system. It's a halfway house. It's an Irish solution to an Irish problem. Does that make sense?
I was on the board of London Irish a long time ago, about, I was going to say 14, 15 years ago, and it was mooted at that time. there were regulation problems of having another country owning a team in a different territory. So I know that there would and are issues around that. I've always considered London Irish as being like we often forget the history, and the history, not rugby history, but the history of Ireland was that anytime there was a lot of pressure, like I'm saying in our time, 70s, 80s, 90s, people emigrated. They went to the States, Australia, or England, and a lot of them went to the UK. But back in the 50s, a huge amount went to the UK. The sons of, the grandsons of, are very, very Irish, and they fit into that very comfortably. But it also becomes a place for people to go to have experience. And for people who used to do that because rugby was a hobby, then there was no issue. You played for London Irish, you could still play for Ireland. And, you know, we have structures in place in Ireland to try and protect the core players that we have to keep a professional game in Ireland to be the most supportive it can be for the national team. And I think that that is a very good plan. Obviously, I didn't avail of it. I went and played in the UK, and it was different. I could play in the UK and play in Ireland. It's trying to stem the flow of people when people have bigger checks elsewhere to protect your players, that they can do it. I think we went for a blanket ban, and we've left a couple of people through that, with Johnny Sexton going to do it. I think we need to be a little bit more selective on how that actually works, because we need to understand what the viability of the sport is in Ireland. So we should not close the door on having an association with an Irish club. I mean, I look at London Irish, and I wish there were a lot more Irish players playing in there. And we are churning out a lot of players. We have very little spaces for professional players in Ireland. You know, each squad has 50, so that's 4 squads, that's 200. This is in the men's game. You have 200 odd players that you can do it. We have a lot of schools and we have a lot of clubs that have players that don't quite get into that system, but they're very good players. They may develop a bit later. Having an opportunity to have them somewhere else is great. I don't think it detracts from the game. But I think we need a far more nuanced view to how we deal with players at home and away. Having said that, I believe that the system we have is about 95% correct in holding on to the players here.
Might the final 5% be a link-up where, and this could work two ways, where all of a sudden, if you were Irish qualified, you would be drawn to play for London Irish, knowing that the Irish selectors are now considering players who play there for international honours, and sending players over who are coming back from injury for a year, or who are developmental, or who are at the end of their career for a year, who want to go and have a different experience. Should we have a link up with London Irish, like an official formalised, where we don't take, the IRFU don't take an ownership stake, but they will say we will continue to select players for Ireland only if they play for London Irish?
I think that's interesting. I think that may be considered a restraint of trade. It'd be really interesting to get a legal view under whether you could say that publicly, and it would be that formal. But I think it could be, again, a sort of nuanced version that you actually still have a chance to play for Ireland if you're playing in London Irish. You know, I don't quite know what the legality of that is. I also know that the clubs in England get supports for the players that they put through their system that qualify to play for England, and whether that then becomes an issue dealing with the IRFU. Look, this is a topic for another State of the Union, because we get people on who can answer those questions rather than we speculate whether these things are allowed or not allowed. But look, I think if we are under pressure, especially in technical positions, in 2, 9, 2, 3, 9, 10, right? Those players, if we have 4 out halves playing for Ireland in the 4 provinces and they're all Irish, we're in a pretty good place. But you get 1 or 2 injuries and suddenly you're struggling. Strength and depth for us is an issue in a technical position. Always has been. We're much stronger now than we have ever been. And there were times where we had only 1 guy fit in those positions, and after that, you were talking to a guy who wasn't. He became international, but wouldn't have been international level. But for the dearth of depth, we have a lot more depth. This just makes it deeper still. And I don't know. I don't know where that fits in with everything as it stands at the moment. But I think we need to further that conversation.
Yeah, we'll definitely do it more in depth. It's clear though that those conversations are certainly being had at senior level, and we'll try and do a bit more digging to see how far they got. That technical point that you're making there brings us nicely to our final issue, and that is the dearth in the front row of depth at the moment. We've seen our best club side be annihilated at scrum time by Saracens, and it's the winning and losing of the game in many respects. It's been the losing of the game against England on a couple of occasions, all the way going back to a decade ago when Tom Court was famously pressed into service on the wrong side of the scrum and performed exactly how you would expect. What can we do to try and fix the issue immediately, and what's our midterm plan for this?
Well, it's funny, I look back on it, and we did a piece after that game, but I look back on it since scrummaging. The front row always get blamed, right? And bearing in mind I'm part of the front row union, I'm going to cast the blame elsewhere. I'm not. It's a big technical position. It's an incredibly tough position. Tight head in particular, I would say probably tight head, hooker, loose head, though loose heads wouldn't like that. They're incredibly tough. But you are utterly reliant on all 8 scrummaging. And having a great scrummaging tight head second row is very important, but ensuring your back row is down is incredibly important. For me, in that Leinster game, it seemed almost like a lack of concentration of all 8 all the time. Now, that is something that can be changed in a week. It doesn't mean you become a better scrummer or a better... It doesn't mean that you win every scrum, but it means you're in a better position all the time. You have to be crafty against Saracens, because Saracens are crafty, and people kind of bemoan that fact, but it was ever thus. And I have a jersey up there from the Lions, and Paul Wallace scrummaging would have been definitely on the more illegal side going in. It was phenomenally effective. He could do it incredibly well. He was very strong in that position. He sold a very good story to the referee, and we based a lot of depowering a much, much bigger team by us being lower and Wally being able to not lose his feet and stay almost with his hips square and his shoulders in. It was extraordinary, and you have to do all of those things. So I think they can be changed. We need to dedicate more time and attention to it, and we have been incredibly limited in the amount of training that has happened up to this year. So, the reason I haven't got overly upset or excited by rugby so far is we have had teams trying to get to the peak of their game 3 weeks into a season, effectively. That's incredibly difficult.
Yeah.
And some teams have done it better than others, and some teams have done it a week later than others. And some of them have put everything into doing it and haven't been able to finish it the following week, which is what happened to Saracens. Saracens put everything into the game against Leinster.
And it was it's the end of their next 18 months of top class rugby, really. Tadhg Furlong's got a calf injury following on from the injury that he had apparently just recovered from, so it looks like he's going to be struggling for the 2 remaining Six Nations games. Do you just give Andrew Porter as many minutes as you possibly can now at this level to try and speed up the quality experience he's getting? Even if he's struggling in games, do you say, in the long run, what we need is for him to come through these struggles? Or do you take somebody like that out and say, we don't want you to have your confidence damaged by this? What's the balance?
I think it's strangely, it's both, because Andrew Porter is incredibly young for a tight head. And for me, I'm really upset that Furlong's injured. He's 27. 27, you're in your pomp at 27. Now, it used to be about 31 for tight head props, where they were at their best. But Furlong has got the experience behind him. He should be the most indispensable Irish player that we have. Andrew Porter, I think, has been wrongly criticised over the last period of time. I think he offers quite a lot. But I would have him and maybe John Ryan in together at different times. And I often go back to how Australia dealt with Jeremy Paul back when I was playing, and Michael Foley. Michael Foley was an older player, was considered to be the mentor for Jeremy Paul, and Jeremy Paul was seen as the star. And sometimes they put Michael Foley on for the first 20 minutes and get Jeremy Paul to play for the next hour, which seemed totally counterintuitive. But they just said, Foley, take this thing out of the tail, and you let Jeremy kind of deal with it afterwards. I think we need to manage how we're using our players. I do think we do manage it. But he has had to carry a load when the main guy in Furlong hasn't been around for all those matches. He's had to carry most of that load. And he's still very young. So I don't write off him in any way, shape or form. And it's how do you manage him properly?
Yeah.
So he may start and he may sit on the bench. And I don't think it matters either way. I think he will learn his way through it. But you don't learn it by being humiliated. You learn it from the next time you go in and play, you get it right, and you might get taken off before that happens. But if I was a front row forward, I would be giving a bollocking to all the back rows. No sticking your head up to check and see what's happening, lads, because I'm being hung out to dry. It's very hard for a young fella to say that, but that's why it's a team game, and why scrummaging is the all 8. It's how do you get the most out of that, and you're reliant on it. And so some players get exposed in that. Furlong mightn't get as exposed because he's craftier and he's been around a lot longer. But look, I think Porter's the future. I think our depth chart's very good. We just happen to have injuries at the moment. And that makes life very tough when you suddenly have 2 internationals from last season to be played, another competition of internationals, followed by next year's 6 Nations. That will expose fault lines in every single team.
And the South Africans after that, and then the Lions after that. So it's a lot of rugby to be played between now and the end of the summer. Keith, great stuff as always. Thanks a million.
Pleasure. Cheers, Ger.